Chapitre 6, the Imparfait. So we're going to look at the conjugation of the Imparfait, how do we conjugate it, and also the uses. When do you use the Imparfait? When do you use the Passé Composé? So let's begin primarily with uses. Okay, so remember, Imparfait is always a past tense. So these are the only two that we have to choose between, is Passé Composé or Imparfait. If your sentence is happening at any other point in time besides the past, it's not going to be one of these two. The three main uses of the imparfait are descriptions, habits, and background information. Okay, so anytime we're describing things, describing what people were like, describing what the weather was like, setting the scene, okay, this is imparfait. If we're talking about habits, things that we did frequently, especially if we're saying how often we did them, okay, so if we're saying like every week or every other summer or something like that, you don't actually have to have that phrase in order to use the imparfait. The use of the imparfait by itself tells you that it is a habit, but those phrases do tend to go together. Then that's the imparfait. And also background information. So things that aren't the main focus of the story, but you are giving them some kind of information like to set the scene, to let you know what was going on, but it's not the main idea. Okay. So remember when we had our analogy? Okay, so this was comparable to being the narrator and the scenery of our play. Okay, so it's kind of sitting back a little bit. The passé composé, therefore, is used for the actors in our play. Okay, so one-time events, okay, this is to contrast with the idea of a habit. Okay, our main plot points, okay, so the main parts of the story that we're focusing on, the main event, the reason that we're talking about this, as well as interruptions. So let's take a closer look at the interruptions because that tends to be the one that throws us off the most. An interruption sentence will actually have both tenses in the same sentence. So whichever activity was happening first is in the imparfait. That's because this is considered to be background information. The activity that interrupts the first one is in the passé composé. This is the main plot point that we're focusing on in the story. So we have some kind of a background going on. Hey, la-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da, boom, one specific event happens and it catches our attention, and that's what we're focusing on. So to give you an example of what this looks like in a sentence, if I say je lisais quand tu as téléphoné, I was reading when you called. The was reading is in the imparfait because it's the activity that was happening first. It's the background information. We're setting the scene of what it was like. And then boom, that got disrupted by this main plot point, the main focus of our sentence, you called me. Our conjugation. Remember that the imparfait conjugates from a new stem. Okay, so you have to conjugate the present tense new form and then drop the final O and S in order to find the stem. This means that a lot of ER and RE verbs are going to have the exact same new stem as they had in the présent. Okay? This isn't always true, but a vast majority of the time. Irregular verbs and IR verbs have a very different new stem, simply because the endings of those aren't always O and S. Okay? For example, with IR verbs, it's ISS, O and S. We're only getting rid of the O and S, so therefore most of our IR, imparfait new stems, will end in that ISS. We can even use this method to find the stems of irregular verbs with one exception, and that's être. Okay, so remember that nous sommes is the only verb in French that does not have an O and S at the end of the new form. It doesn't exist, therefore we can't drop it. So we have an irregular stem for être, which is the stem et, okay? E accent aigu T. Okay? This is the only irregular stem in the entire French language because it's the only verb that doesn't have an O and S in the present. All we have to do once we found the stem is add the endings. Okay? AIS, AIS, AIT, IONS, that should say IEZ, my apologies, and AIENT. So let's run through some examples. Okay, if I have je and jouer, and I want to conjugate it in the imparfait, the first thing I have to do is conjugate jouer in the present tense with the new form. So we would say nous jouons. To find my stem, I get rid of the final ONS, and I'm left with JOU. That's my stem. Now all I have to do is put it back into my original sentence with the je, and then add the je ending. Je jouais. We can do this with an irregular verb as well. So if we have elle and avoir. Okay, so we're going to conjugate avoir in the present tense for nous. So we'd have nous avons. We're going to get rid of our final ONS to find the stem AV. And then all we have to do is add the ending from above that matches elle. AIENT. Elles avaient. Be very careful when you're looking at those activities where they say, oh, should you use the present, the passé composé, or the imparfait? The imparfait can be very, very difficult to tell apart from the présent in the nous and the vous forms because the only difference in 99% of verbs is going to be that I in the imparfait. That's because our nous form of the présent was already our stem. So we know that we're going to have the exact same beginning for nous and nous in the present and the imparfait. The only difference is the present adds the ONS ending and the imparfait adds IONS. Same thing with vous. We have a little bit more variance in the vous simply because we have a tendency, especially in irregular verbs, where the vous form might not always match the nous form stem. Okay? However, we have the exact same problem with a regular verb where the endings are extremely similar. We have a regular stem plus an EZ for the present and a regular stem plus an IEZ for the imparfait. Also, be sure that you're paying a lot of attention to the context. Okay? If you're looking at it and you can't remember if it's imparfait or présent, okay, then think about that usage rule. Okay? Is it happening in the past? If you can't figure out if it's happening in the past or the present, then you're going to ask yourself, does it fit the uses for the imparfait? Is it a description? Is it a habit? Or is it background information? If it's one of those three things, there's an extremely good chance that it's the imparfait. Yes, it could still be présent and be one of those things and you just can't tell. Okay? Really, you should be able to tell if there's an I in the middle of the word or not. Okay? However, if you forget on the final exam, this is a pretty decent backup system. All right. So the difference between the imparfait and the passé composé is admittedly fairly complicated. Okay, it's something that can take quite a bit of practice, and eventually, I promise it does eventually become second nature. Okay, I really don't think about it all that much anymore, but it's a very complicated topic the very first time you try to get your brain around it. Okay, so here are two more online resources that I personally think are pretty good and useful. Okay? So the FrenchToday.com blog, okay, Passé Composé versus Imparfait. This is a pretty good one. It's a long read, admittedly, but it's a really good explanation of the two different past tenses. It gives a good explanation not only of the context in which you use each one, but in how it's not a matter of translation. That's, I think, one of the hardest things about imparfait versus passé composé. It's not a matter of looking at the words, it's a matter of thinking about the situation. Okay, so this French Today does a really good job of explaining how that all works, and they give a lot of examples that I think might be helpful for you. And then your second link there, okay, the Columbia, okay, from Columbia College. This is actually not a description. It's not going to explain anything to you. But this is a really quick, fun, easy, good online quiz where it's giving you a sentence and then you have three choices. You have the imparfait form, the passé composé form, and the présent. Okay? And when you make each one of your choices, it tells you if you got it right or wrong, but it also tells you why you got it right or why you got it wrong. That's the most explaining it does, but this is a really, really good way. When you start feeling like you've got this down pretty well, this is a great way for you to test it and still get help if maybe you didn't get it quite so awesomely as you thought you did.